Kia ora kutu katoa, everybody. John Fraser, I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences, and welcome to COVID-19 webinar, part 2. This is in response to a number of inquiries and requests from staff about some more information, particularly about Omicron. And I'm delighted to introduce our panelists from last time, Paparangi, you remember, Nikki Turner, Helen Pertussis-Harris, and a special welcome to Dr. Stephen Ritchie, who's an infectious disease specialist at Auckland Hospital. I do send apologies from Colin Tukuya Tonga. He's not well today, so we are one member short. So I'd just like to start by asking Paparangi if she wouldn't mind giving a mini whakatau before we start.
Tēnā koutou katoa. E honore, he karorea, he maungarongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Tihei mauri ora. Huri noi tēnei hui a topa, tēnā koutou katoa. Back to you, John.
Kia ora, Paparangi, and thank you very much. Okay, so we have a number of written questions that we've received beforehand, and I'm sure some of you will have some online questions that you might like to ask. We're going to hold that off until we've finished some of the written questions. We do have a lot, so I'm not sure we'll get through them all. But as last time, we're very happy to provide answers in a written format after the webinar. I thought I would just start off by introducing the subject of Omicron. I'm sure everybody knows about it. Obviously, we're in a peak surge at the moment. Currently, the case numbers in New Zealand are nearly 400,000. That's almost 6-7% of the total population of New Zealand. And that's all occurred in the space of little over a month. So it gives you some idea of the infectious nature of Omicron. So Omicron is a new strain of SARS. It's not actually a new strain. It probably originated very early on in the pandemic. We just didn't see it until late last year. But in 6 months, it has taken the world by storm. It has now become the dominant strain worldwide. It started in South Africa, as you know, last year, but it has outcompeted every single other SARS-CoV-2 strain on the planet. And this may be, as some are suggesting, what's called the peak fitness variant of SARS-CoV-2, simply because it will take an extraordinary new variant to outcompete the infectiousness of Omicron and become dominant. Viruses evolve to increase their fitness, and this often means trading virulence in favor of transmission, and this seems to be exactly what Omicron has done. So just a couple of basic facts. The R0 for Omicron is about 4 times that of Delta. That's the reproductive number. And Delta had a reproductive number of 5, which makes Omicron around 20. That would make it probably the most contagious, infectious contagion known to man. Measles usually had the record at around about 18, so 20 is really getting up there. That means that in a naive, unvaccinated population, one person will infect on average 20 other people. And of course, asymptomatic carriage further facilitates transmission. That's the perfect recipe for an unstoppable contagion, and yes, it's probably not going to go away. Omicron, as you're probably aware by now, is less virulent than Delta, and for most people it causes mild-like symptoms characteristic of an uncomplicated upper respiratory tract infection, that is the nose and throat. Data from overseas, multiple countries indicate that only 1.1% of Omicron cases require hospitalization, whereas for Delta that was around 10%. And New Zealand data is appearing very similar because of our high vaccination rate, but the problem is it's all coming at once. We can talk a little bit about why Omicron is less virulent than Delta, but I think we'll probably now lead into some of the questions, and hope some of those basic facts give you a starting point to follow up on some of these other questions. So we've had a number of questions around severity, infection rates, and the comparison between Omicron and Delta. One question is, what would your advice to the average New Zealander still be to try and avoid catching Omicron, or just give in to the inevitable? So I'm going to ask all of our panelists to answer this one, starting with Nikki and Paparangi, Stephen and Helen.
Kia ora. It's a common question. I mean, the traditional, should you have chickenpox parties? The answer is no, and there's 2 reasons. One is, from a community perspective, we don't want everyone to get sick all at once because we won't cope. We're only just coping with our health services at the moment. And the second is that even though the risk to any fully vaccinated individual is low, it's still not zero. And we don't actually know the percentage of long COVID, and you can get long COVID even from mild disease. So don't forget, mild disease may not necessarily be mild. And the same argument follows with children, that even though the majority of children get COVID mildly, there's around 1 in 3,000 that get this multi-inflammatory system condition, which when you have large numbers of children is quite significant. So you can't say, no, an individual's never going to get a severe response or a longer term response. So all in all, at this stage, no, I wouldn't recommend it. Even though if you do end up having COVID and you're vaccinated, you do, the vaccination plus the wild disease should give you pretty good immunity.
Paparangi.
Yes, I'd agree with Nikki on a number of levels, including just the public health risk of spreading and the health services being overwhelmed at the moment. But also, I see the evidence coming out that people who've had brain scans, even people who've had mild disease and seem to have recovered fully, still have some evidence that they have had organ damage through different scanning. And so I don't know, but I'm of an age where I don't think my brain scan needs any acceleration of its downward trend. And so I think that we should stay as healthy as possible because we don't understand what long COVID might mean to us. So I agree, the risk is not zero, and I'm still holed up and staying safe.
Stephen.
Yeah, totally agree. I think in the hierarchy of preventing an infectious disease like COVID, together with vaccination, avoiding exposure is really important. So that means if you're sick, staying at home and staying away from others, and it means doing what you can to avoid coming into contact with others. I think it's a very sensible approach to look after your own health.
And Helen.
Don't think there's much more to add. Let's not all get it at once, and generally infectious diseases are to be avoided rather than embraced.
Thank you, everybody. Another question. If somebody is a household contact but manages to avoid catching COVID, does that likely mean that their immunity is pretty good and they're less likely to catch it another time if they come in contact with another COVID case? Nikki.
Yeah, so the answer is you can't answer that. So what we know from household studies is up to maybe 70% of the household will catch it, but you don't know if the other 30% did catch it and were asymptomatic or actually managed not to be exposed. And I think there's a question in the chat about that as well, that even if Omicron's around, some people may not have actually got infected. So then they won't have had an immune response. So they're still immune naive. And you actually don't know that. Also, remember, households are all different. They're not all the same. So some households where you're more crowded, there's less ventilation, you're much more likely to actually catch it and have an immune response. Whereas other households, particularly those who are fortunate to have big houses and less people in them, may get away with not actually contacting the virus at all. So, you can't really give an absolute answer to that one.
Thank you. Let's move on to another one. Is Omicron still spread by surfaces or just air transmission, and how likely is it that you could catch Omicron if you're outside in an uncrowded space? Stephen, do you want to?
Yeah, so absolutely it'll be spread through surfaces. So that is a surface that's been contaminated by someone else's droplets, so tiny little particles of mucus that contain the virus. They emerge from us when we cough and sneeze. They can contaminate a surface and for a period of time remain infectious on that surface. So someone else could come along, touch that surface and then accidentally inoculate themselves. The amount of virus required to cause an infection that way is pretty low. So yes, that can happen. It happens with influenza and other cold viruses as well. At the moment though, that'll be the predominant form of transmission will be from people who are coughing and sneezing, and therefore the virus is inhaled into the upper airways that way. I think being outside on a nice sunny day in a park is a great way to avoid exposure. And I think the risks in those sorts of situations, unless you're taking part in a protest outside of Parliament, the risks in those sorts of exposures would be low, provided you keep a little away from other groups of people.
Thank you, Stephen. Here's a question about vaccine efficacy, boosters and immunity. So what is the latest research on the 4th vaccination booster, especially for those who are immune suppressed? Is Pfizer or other pharmaceutical companies likely to release a new vaccination variant anytime soon for Omicron or new COVID variants? And is it worth waiting before getting a 4th dose? Nikki, I think that's in your court.
I think there's a couple of questions in that. So firstly, the difference between vaccine effectiveness to Delta and Omicron is that for the first 2 doses, the drop-off in effectiveness against symptomatic disease is much quicker with Omicron, hence the importance of the booster. And I think everybody's heard us saying that it's really important, particularly for Omicron, you need the booster because there's a drop-off. Now, the difference is the drop-off is mostly mild disease, whereas, the data to date is showing, even with Omicron, that 4 to 6 months later, you're still getting good protection against severe disease, which is the major target now. So what we've lost with vaccines is a degree of protection against mild disease, which means that they're less effective against transmission. There is still some effectiveness, but less with Omicron. We still have protection against severe disease, including in the elderly. Now, the question really arises is, who is at high risk? When is their protection to severe disease likely to drop off? So when and if are we likely to need boosting? So I'm just crystal ball gazing at this point because there are different decisions around the world. The Israelis tried boosting, didn't work very well. The UK is currently boosting for over 75s. It's looking like those who are more at risk, as their protection against severe disease drops, they may well need boosting. That's not the whole population. That would just be high risk groups, and it may end up looking a bit like a flu type scenario. So that's about boosting. Now, there was another question in that I've forgotten along the way. There was a second part to it.
Other variants. Other variant vaccines.
Other variants. Yes. So look, the companies have designed vaccines to other variants, but because the vaccine is currently holding up very well to this variant, at this stage, there is no need to go ahead. Now, if you had a variant that changed dramatically, then you'd be back in a pandemic flu or the beginning of the scenario, you'd have to revaccinate everybody. But that is not the case. The variants that have come up to date, you've still got conserved approach to your immune response from the vaccine. So at this stage, the vaccines are holding up pretty well against other variants, and it's looking promising, but we just all have to wait and watch. And there's some things we just can't answer.
If I can just add a little bit to that, I mean, immunity really is dependent on multiple factors, which really depend on what type of vaccine you've used. But the current vaccine that we do have appears to be very effective at stimulating both the B cell and T cell immune response. And it's a T cell immune response which appears to have that broad cross-variant coverage because it uses a different mechanism for identifying conserved bits of the spike protein. So although the jury's still out, it's believed that the T-cell immunity is what's providing that long-term memory response against severe disease, as opposed to the short-term antibody response that's used to block the virus from infecting. If you get it, how strong is your immunity afterwards and for how long? Nikki?
I think that's similar to what we've just discussed, is that once you get disease, you do have immunity for a period of time. But we know with Omicron, and we've seen in the UK, that 65% of the cases now are recurrent. So basically, you can get it again and again and again. You'd expect it to be more mild because you're getting immunity every time when you've been vaccinated or if you've had disease. Now, I think it's useful to know that the data is showing that vaccination is actually giving better immunity than disease. But we are seeing repeated infections. So you do know that it's not like measles, it's not lifelong protection, and you're likely to get it again. But we're familiar with that respiratory illness, and it's not at all a surprise that your immunity does wane over time, and you can repeatedly get infections. The big difference is you then have some natural immunity for the repeat infection that you did not have in the first case.
And again, I can add, there is good evidence from scientific studies that the combination of vaccination and natural infection provides what's called hybrid immunity. That's simply because vaccination really only targets a single protein on the virus, the spike protein, whereas natural infection, there are 14 other proteins in the coronavirus, and natural infection does generate immunity against some of those other more conserved proteins. So yes, I think combination of vaccination and natural infection provides much broader protection against all the other SARS-CoV-2 variants. This is a question around the fourth booster, mentions the Israeli study, which appeared to be unimpressive results. So does a fourth booster provide extra protection? Anybody answer that one?
I think we've touched on it. Sorry for me again. Oh, I'll pass to Helen, but I was just going to say we've touched on it and we've really got to wait and see. Helen, sorry, over to you.
Yeah, no, I think it doesn't look like it'll benefit most people, but maybe for those people who are very high at risk, very elderly, it might help to stimulate a few more antibodies, but not in general.
Okay. Do people who are vaccinated or boosted shed less of a viral load when they get it than people who aren't vaccinated?
So what I could say there is it depends on your degree. I mean, firstly, once you're symptomatic, you've got the same viral load, but people who are unvaccinated are more likely to get symptomatic and more likely to get severely symptomatic. Therefore, on that base, they're more likely to spread. That's the difference.
I think they're also infectious for a shorter period.
Yeah.
Those who've received a vaccine.
Yeah.
Here's another question about boosters. I think that's already been answered. Now we get on to long COVID. There are a few questions about long COVID. Could we have an overview of what is known about long COVID? I'm not sure we can do that in the time we have left, unfortunately, such as rates of occurrence and how they differ between different strains. But long COVID, do we know yet if vaccination lowers the risk of long COVID? And the obvious question is long COVID less likely to occur with Omicron? Anybody?
I can perhaps start a discussion on it. Helen, go for it. So there are studies looking at whether vaccination protects against long COVID. And the results are generally showing that yes, it does. There's a reasonably impressive effect of preventing long COVID. So long COVID has unfortunately lots of definitions, but in Oxford, they've used a definition of ongoing serious symptoms at around the kind of 3 to 6 month mark. And a study did show that about a third of people, or perhaps even slightly more than a third of people, this was last year, pre-Omicron, had symptoms at that late period. The symptoms themselves vary. They can be anywhere in the sort of body. There's people have multiple symptoms. Fatigue is a really common one, loss of concentration and brain fog, loss of smell, you name it. There's lots of things that can happen. And in terms of knowing whether Omicron is less likely to cause long COVID, I just don't think we know yet. We need that duration of time before we can sort of get these measurements and understand more about it. Nikki said earlier that long COVID, she made the point that long COVID occurs in people with even mild and perhaps even asymptomatic infections can get long COVID. It does, however, seem that people with more serious disease are more likely to get long COVID. I think that's probably going to be true of Omicron as well. And so if more people are getting fairly mild disease, we're hoping that the risk of long COVID will be lower with Omicron. There'll still be lots of people affected though, because as you pointed out at the beginning, there's 400,000 people living with Omicron at the moment. So it's going to be a big problem for lots of New Zealanders, for sure.
All right, let's move on to another question. This is a rather long one, and I'm not sure I can read it all out, but it's really around panel's thoughts and advice on the pace of adaptation for Kiwis as we navigate Omicron in a vastly different way to previous variants. So I guess the general question is, are we treating Omicron differently to other variants? I think the answer is yes. Does anybody want to elaborate and the reasons why we have to treat it differently?
I guess I'll start with the thought that, New Zealand started at the beginning believing in an elimination strategy, which we realise is not possible now. And what we've all talked about is the big difference with Omicron is that the vaccination is less effective. against transmission. So that I think what we're learning in Omicron, and I've been suggesting we need a respiratory strategy going forward, but this is going to be with us now for a long time in our respiratory repertoire. It's beginning to look and feel a bit more like how we should have been managing influenza for years and years and years. And I think the importance is vaccinations alone are not the answer here. They're not going to stop transmission. We're not going to get elimination. We're going to have to work with public health measures going forward for a long time. Now, this is a new headspace for New Zealand. So it's walking with, you know, vaccines, how effective they are and how effective they aren't, alongside mask wearing, when is it appropriate, hand washing, social distancing, how do we manage in our work and in our school space. I think this is all of New Zealand just moving together and walking together along a new headspace around managing for the whole community a better approach to respiratory illness. And if I'm allowed just to divert a bit, the point about children and under 5s that somebody's asked us is that they've actually got a higher risk of death from flu than from COVID. So your question about whether the child should go to early childcare and how do we protect them most is we need to get a respiratory headspace for us all. Flu, COVID and RSV and all the other things as well. And trying to walk with everybody along this conversation and how it evolves, I think, is the way it's going to work.
Thanks, Nikki. Anybody want to add anything to that? Paparangi, do you have a view on the
well, I
approach?
definitely want to promote the idea that we have to manage it in conjunction with public health approaches, and especially mask wearing, especially I think ventilation in schools will become more important as we move forward, and some of our normal practices. And some of the public health practices should become part of our normal practice. And we have maybe visited some countries where mask wearing is pretty normal if someone is ill, for instance, and how we should start thinking about that culturally, taking that on board as part of our New Zealand identity. So I agree with what Nikki's saying about not only having a strategy for respiratory illness, but also taking on board some new parts of the things that we've learned over the past couple of years about keeping ourselves safe and being kind to others by not spreading our germs to others.
All right. So, just raise a basic question that isn't part of the written questions, but it's one that's been brought up several times. And what's the likelihood of further mutants, and will they be more or less serious? I think most people feel very nervous about the potential for Omicron to evolve into something nastier. I can comment on that. Does anybody else want to talk about the likelihood of new virulent strains appearing? I mean, the reality is that viruses evolve. They're always evolving, and they do so by mutations. And typically they evolve to become more fit. So inevitably you will get what's called the peak fitness variant of a virus, which takes several years depending on how infectious the virus was. What viruses want to do more than anything else is transmit. They're not interested in being virulent. They're not interested in killing the host. In fact, making people sick it works against the virus, because when people get sick, they go to bed and they don't transmit. So any strain that increases transmission without reducing, or by reducing the virulence, is considered to be a more successful strain. So Omicron is a very successful strain. The likelihood of that reverting back to a more virulent strain is becoming less and less as we see how strong the competition is against all the other strains. I mean, remember that Omicron has overtaken every other single variant around the world in 6 months. So it's going to have a very, very special variant to outcompete Omicron. That's not to say that we won't get variants. We are seeing variants now, but those are mainly genetic variants, the BA.2 and BA.1. There might be a slight advantage for BA.2, but it's only a mild advantage, and we're not seeing any greater virulence from that strain. Does anybody else want to?
I think you said it well.
Yeah, I would just add that we do have a lot of experience with other respiratory viruses. There are many respiratory viruses that cause colds and flu-like illnesses in New Zealanders every winter, every summer for that matter. And they don't, or haven't in the past, ever become more virulent over time. They maintain virulence. They often don't sort of dribble away to nothing. But yeah, for the most part, viruses, as you said, John, don't revert back to a more nasty form. So I'm got every finger I have crossed that Omicron follows exactly the same ongoing process.
Great, thank you very much. Right, we might move on to some of the online questions. First question, is there evidence to indicate how to tell long COVID is emerging, or is it just time that tells if you're developing long COVID? Stephen?
Yeah, so it's time. It's the definition is long. The clue's in the name. So it's roughly sort of 3 to 6 months post having their primary illness. It's the ongoing symptoms, and they can be totally different symptoms to what you had at the beginning. So you might get a head cold, of course, with COVID at the beginning, and you might end up, the long COVID manifestation could be a gastrointestinal upset. So yeah, but it's the time, and that's why we don't know what the risk is with Omicron yet. It's only been around or circulating in high numbers since about December.
Here's another one. Could we have a quick description of long COVID? I think that's going to be a tough one.
Helen and Nikki may have something to add to what I've already tried to describe.
Yeah, I think it's tricky because it's not always a single issue. So long COVID has got a whole lot of things in it. Some of it can look like chronic fatigue syndrome, ME. So it does get a bit complicated. So it does require quite a long conversation, that it may not be a single entity. It may be a mixture of entities. And you've got to tease out the difference between the entity post-COVID, which is like a post-viral type fatigue, versus the background rate that people get these conditions all the time as well. So it is actually a very complicated story to accurately portray what long COVID is looking like at this stage.
Okay, here's another question. For those who have a pre-existing condition such as asthma, who are at high risk for severe illness or reactions, how practical will it be in the long term to avoid COVID, especially as the behaviours of other low risk people change or relax over time? It's a good question.
It's a really good question. I think it goes back to the point about a respiratory strategy in general, that we should be protecting ourselves more generally from respiratory illness. And so if COVID does, and when it settles into a seasonal pattern like we do with flu, we can look at ways of protecting ourselves when it's particularly in large numbers and surging. Nobody's recommending flu parties, and I don't believe in the long run we'll be recommending that for COVID either. We'll be looking at pragmatic ways of when there's a lot of COVID in the community to try and protect the people, particularly those who are most vulnerable. And I think once again it is going to start looking like improving our approach both to flu and COVID for protecting those who are most at risk.
Here's a simple one. What masks would you recommend for long-haul overseas flights at this time, please? The most comfortable and the most effective. Any suggestions?
I think it's all about getting a decent seal, and having to wear an N95 every day. I have to say it would be really hard to wear an N95 throughout a long haul. But the ones that have a decent seal, and you don't want to wear material, you do want the surgical ones rather than fabric. That's about the best I can offer. Anyone else got better suggestions?
No, I'd agree. I think the medical masks are more effective. So they trap those tiny little particles of mucus with viruses contained in them using electrostatic forces. The cloth masks probably don't do quite so efficiently. And yes, wearing a well-fitted N95 mask for longer than a few hours, once the mask gets moist, they become ineffective anyway. So I think, yeah, it needs to be comfortable so that it stays on when you're snoozing. And I think a reasonably well-fitted medical type mask would be the way to go.
Thank you. Do you agree with the current incubation period is adequate in cases overseas? Some people have not shown, it's just stuck out for 90 days. Does anybody want to answer that?
Do you mean that they're still showing positive after 90 days? Because that often happens. Showing positive doesn't mean you're infectious. I think that's important to differentiate that. And the current 7 days covers the majority of people, but there will always be the occasional person who may be able to shed for longer. So there's always that risk. It's a sort of a trade-off. But for the majority of people, within 7 days, you should not be transmitting or at extremely low rates after you've been positive for 7 days.
Unless you've got symptoms, maybe.
Yes, that's true. If you've got symptoms, you're still likely to be transmissible. So stay at home till you haven't got symptoms.
Okay, here's a question from Jason Capito. My question is one that would Omicron produce a better immunity than a booster that is designed from a predecessor variant that is no longer in circulation? Well, I guess the answer is probably yes, which is why the vaccine companies are developing Omicron-specific vaccination. But I firmly believe that the current vaccine, which was based on the old Alpha variant, this was the first one that arose from Wuhan in China, is still producing sufficient immunity to protect against serious illness. It's not as good in producing those antibodies that block infection in the nasal cavity, but it appears to be providing very good protection against. So whether it's worth waiting for a new vaccine from Pfizer or Moderna, I guess time will tell, but those vaccines are undergoing clinical trials at the moment. Here's a question to me regarding trade-off between virulence and transmission. Are they mutually exclusive? Surely there could be evolution that promotes transmissibility without dismissing virulence. That said, is there a sense that an evolution beyond Omicron could become more severe and virulent than the current strain? Ooh, that's a great question. And it basically speaks to why Omicron is less virulent than Delta. And the reason is that Omicron has mutations in the spike protein that have increased its affinity for its receptor, the ACE2 receptor, which means that the virus is more efficient in affecting the cells of the nasal cavity. But the trade-off has been a loss of a second receptor called TMPRSS2, which is more prevalent in the lungs. And that receptor is used to fuse the virus into cells, which means that Omicron is less virulent because it doesn't infect lung cells nearly as efficiently as Delta does. And the difference is roughly calculated about 70-fold. So Omicron is significantly more infectious and significantly less virulent because it doesn't infect lung cells nearly as efficiently as Delta. So it has traded off that virulence, ability to infect lung cells, for an increased ability to infect the epithelial cells of the nasopharynx. So is Omicron likely to go back to increased ability to infect lung cells? I guess I can't see why, because Omicron is significantly more infectious than Delta. So the variant would have to be more virulent and also outcompete the infectiousness of Omicron. I hope that makes sense. Clear Cinema, why is the message to avoid exposure not being applied to primary school students, in particular those at year levels where mask wearing is not required and ventilation is questionable? When a child asks, why should I have to go to a crowded place inside where others aren't masked when adults don't have to? What should I say?
I think this is a question for government policy, really, isn't it? I mean, I think we all feel that you've got to balance the pragmatism with the most useful way of reducing transmission. And I think for the education sector, that's a really hard balance. So, you know, we're all very strongly in support of mask wearing, particularly in closed confines, and ventilation and staggered classrooms and all the things that can make a difference. And in the end, it's how the education sector can actualize that and how the community will support it. So if we push measures that community aren't going to buy into, they're not going to work. Whereas if we give up on all measures, and you know, I have to say I disagree with the UK policy that just gave up on everything overnight, then you're going to get a lot more respiratory spread. So this is a pragmatic policy answer alongside our science, I think.
Okay, and that's a tough question to answer, and it's probably not for us because that is indeed a policy question. From Jay, if you're fully vaccinated and up to date with boosters, but you still catch Omicron, are there any lasting effects to your health even after you've recovered? Again, that speaks to long COVID and the degree of severity of long COVID with Omicron. Stephen, do you want to? I think you've already answered that, haven't you, Aaron?
Well, I think the message is, I mean, for the most part, no. So most people will catch Omicron, or who do catch Omicron, will have a brief mild illness, hopefully without requiring trips to the doctors or the hospital, and will recover fully. And I think that's an important message for people to obviously understand and know, because that's how we manage to get on with our lives.
Mariana, how worried should we be with new variants, i.e. Deltacron? I think probably I just answered that question. I mean, there's no guarantee that a new mutant won't arise. I mean, Omicron really came from nowhere. It was completely unexpected, and it's so very different from all the other strains that had been circulating at the time. So, there's no guarantee that there won't be other variants, but the question of whether those variants are going to be more or less virulent, I think speaks to the question of how well they can outcompete Omicron, which is already incredibly infectious. Just assume that, we're at now 400,000 cases in New Zealand, and that's only taken 1 month. So it's an incredibly infectious virus. So any new variant is going to have to be able to outcompete that transmissibility. Can we protect ourselves and others just with a good face mask over nose and mouth? Can we still get Omicron through our eyes? Want to know if this is a myth and whether there's any research to prove that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a myth, but it depends on the setting, I think. So in the early phases of COVID epidemic or COVID pandemic, it became apparent that for healthcare workers wearing face masks or eye protection, when I do rounds in the hospital, I'm wearing these big goggles that fit over my glasses, and they're probably adding to the overall PPE that I'm wearing. But PPE is sort of only one small component of infection prevention control. The bottom of the base of the pyramid is avoiding exposure, and that's the most important thing, of course. So that means staying at home when you're sick, keeping away from others. And New Zealanders need to get better at that, exactly as Nikki said. I think we're getting good at it now after 2 years of this, but we weren't in the past. And then trying to avoid circumstances that might put you at risk of exposure. They're the real fundamental things. So the type of masks and how they fit and things are kind of the tip of that's the icing on the cake. They're important, they're useful. And I don't think, for me, I don't wear goggles when I'm visiting Pack and Save to do my shopping. I use them in a clinical setting where my risk of exposure is higher. I can't avoid that exposure because that's my work. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. Here's a question from Peter Hunter. Tricky one. What is behind the current new surges in cases in China? 300,000 cases and 2,000 deaths weekly. Drop off in the protection vaccination or a new variant? I think it's because the Chinese vaccine isn't very good.
Also, they were trying for an elimination strategy, which is hugely, hugely challenging. And there's only so often that you can lock down millions and millions of people. So, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary, brave strategy they're trying to do, constant lockdown to stop the spread. So alongside the Chinese vaccines, which aren't as highly effective, I think they've got a tall answer. So I think this is just straight Omicron spreading through China would be my guess.
Yeah, I do too. I think Hong Kong's an interesting comparative country because their Omicron surge took off exactly the same time as New Zealand's. Their sort of current climate is similar to New Zealand's. They're sort of having 25, 27 degree sorts of days. Their weather's not too terrible. And they have peaked at about the same time as New Zealand, and their cases are coming down. Yet their death rate is many-fold higher, and I think it reflects a country with a high vaccine rate, Hong Kong, compared to New Zealand, a country with a very high vaccine rate. I think that's the difference is substantial, and we're seeing the benefits actually. And as John points out, the differences in the types of vaccines being used are probably also important.
Helen.
The other thing about Hong Kong is that they failed to vaccinate their elderly very well and did a
Yes.
really good job of the young. So I think that will be reflected in that awful mortality rate.
I think heartbreakingly, that's a key message, that they got like less than 40% of their elderly people vaccinated. And so, you know, New Zealand, we must remember that we've done and continue to need to do well in vaccinating and fully boosting our elderly population. So we've still got a bit of a gap there.
Now here's a very good but very obvious question. How long will the booster stay effective for Omicron, and do we need another booster after a certain time passes?
I think we've sort of had a go at that, but I'll have another go at it. So the protection lasts longer to severe disease, as John has pointed out, with your cellular memory, even when you're sterilising antibodies drop off. So we're looking at, you know, good protection for 4 to 6 months, even in the elderly, which is really remarkable about the mRNA vaccines, that how long the protection against severe diseases have been preserved in the highest risk people. After that, we just don't know. It doesn't mean protection vanishes. It doesn't mean we're going to need to repeatedly vaccinate. That's why we just have to watch and wait. So far we're okay, but New Zealand, all of us are watching this data very closely to see what we do next.
And it is the big question as to how long that long-term memory is going to last, and what long-term memory means. Is it going to be effective protection against serious illness, or we will see that waning as well? Here's a question from Paula Legurley. Rates are increasing in the UK, cases and hospitalisations. I think they're in their second surge at the moment. They're unsure if it is the vaccine waning or new B.2 variant, or just Omicron. Will New Zealand see this, and when? So you want to tackle the UK?
I just want to make another point about the UK, is they gave up on all their public health measures. And back to Paparangi's point, is that overnight they seemed to decide they weren't going to carry on with public health measures because they're all fed up with them. And, you know, we've all been watching the British football and those masses of people with no masks or anything. So, you know, my feeling is that what they left out of that one is also the role of public health measures, and vaccines don't stand alone. So it's going to be a mixture of all of those factors. But I would not like to see New Zealand go down that track, just overnight stop all their public health measures.
I mean, I've got a question for you, Nikki. Perhaps maybe it's a statement, but I don't think their vaccine rates are nearly as high as ours either.
No, they weren't. You're correct, Stephen, they weren't. I mean, even in their healthcare providers, interestingly, their rates were lower than us. And they also didn't work as hard as we're still trying to do about closing their equity gaps. And they've got quite significant equity gaps in their vaccine delivery. So they started off really well, but they sort of lost their momentum a bit. So, you know, I don't think just chucking in extra boosters is going to solve the basic problem, that you've got to get your primary course and booster up as high as you can to start with.
There's also the issue of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was widely used in the UK, not being nearly as effective against Omicron as the mRNA vaccines.
Yeah. And that's correct. So the role of whether AstraZeneca has a place in that, and they started their vaccination program with AstraZeneca for the elderly, not the mRNA. So there's also a question about how much that contributes to the recurrent infection as well.
Oh, here's a question that probably requires a long answer. Catherine Bacon, biologically, why might vaccination give better protection than actually catching the virus? It's a tough question to ask, but the reality is that the mRNA vaccines have proved remarkably effective in driving these very high affinity blocking antibodies that last a long time. And I think it's probably because they focus on the one protein as opposed to an infection, which is focusing on lots of different SARS proteins. There's over 14 different proteins in the virus. So vaccination has appeared quite clearly to provide that profound response that has provided that level of protection that we haven't seen in any of the other vaccines, many of which have been essentially what's called attenuated viruses. So they just kill the virus and then inject that, hoping that that will generate immunity. That doesn't work nearly as well as focusing just on immunizing with the spike protein. And that's just a consequence of trial and error, really. But the mRNA vaccines have proved absolutely superb at doing that. Just going through some more questions. Is there any explanation of why some people become quite ill, display obvious COVID symptoms, and even have household members test positive, but continually test negative for rats? Are there any factors to be aware of? Okay. Paparangi, do you want to? The efficacy of rats.
That's not my area of expertise, but we do have to understand that the rats are a group of different products by different makers, and some have better, or should I say worse false negatives and false positives than others. And so I think that we have to really think about how and when we use rapid antigen testing. At the moment, we're using rapid antigen testing for people who have got symptoms as a diagnostic test, and for their household contacts as a diagnostic test. And that's probably because we're in the middle of an outbreak. But normally we shouldn't necessarily be, we should be careful in the way in which we use rapid antigen tests. And I'm a little bit concerned that everybody's using them just for, you know, something they do after they clean their teeth in the morning almost, and we're overusing them and and thinking that they are of greater importance in surveillance than what I think they really are. But I'll leave it to the other members of the panel to comment further.
I'm not an expert on rats either, but there's a couple of things that I think is really important for us to be aware, is that they're not necessarily that accurate. So a negative rat doesn't mean you haven't got COVID, and that's really important for people to realize. A positive rat, sure, you know, they're highly specific, but negative doesn't mean you haven't got COVID. If you're a family member of somebody who's COVID positive and you've got any of the COVID-like symptoms that we're seeing in truckloads, the sore throat, the blocked runny noses, the headaches, you have COVID, even if your rat's negative, if you're a close household contact. So let's not overuse and over-translate a negative COVID. That would be my plea for everybody.
Thank you. Paparangi, here's one for you. Why do married children have lower vaccination rates, and what can we do to increase these rates?
Well, I think, you know, if there was an easy answer, we would have fixed it by now. And so what we have is we have a complex issue, which relates to access, it relates to trust in the system, it relates to trust in government, and it goes back a long way. And it relates to hesitancy, especially we might be, some adults are more willing to get vaccinated themselves than what they are about the evidence for safety in children. So we have the perfect storm of doubt happening at all these different levels. And yeah, I think that's been a challenge. And I want to say I take my hat off at all the providers who are actually actively working in this area, even just to have the conversations and to make access more freely available. So it's a work in progress, and it's something that we really need to learn to do, because I think, and Nikki alluded to it earlier, we might be dealing okay with Omicron, but in the meantime, our childhood vaccinations for all the other childhood infectious diseases are quite dismal, especially for Māori. So we've still got a lot of work to do in getting our general vaccination rates up. So it's the lessons we learn here will be important for the future of childhood vaccinations generally, and for Māori especially. So I guess that means I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's a big question, and a lot of people are working on that answer.
Helen, here's a question for you. Does vaccine increase risk of stroke and blood clots?
Well, it's an easy one. No. And it reduces your risk, because those are things that can occur with the infection itself. So, and we're very sure of that. There's really good data to support that.
Great, thank you. We've only got 5 minutes left, and there are two questions here which I particularly like. They're questions that we're not going to answer, but I'm able to answer, but I think they're really, really important. So one of them is from Varun Bajwa. as zoonotic spillovers are likely to continue to happen in the future, given the continued destruction of natural habitats for agriculture and housing, is there hope for a more evolved collaboration between policymakers and scientists in the long term? I sure as hell hope so.
Oh, yes, please. We can live in hope. It's been pretty disappointing so far, I have to say. It was great at the start, but nationalism's on the rise again. So a bit gloomy policy-wise.
And the second question which speaks to that is one of the major surges, once the major surges subside and we get into less of a state of focus on COVID, who, the people or organisations, will be watching for any new developments, and where will they be looking and how? Another great question. I think it's quite clear as a result of SARS-CoV-2, and remembering that there have been 2 other variants of coronavirus, SARS in the early turn of the century and then MERS. So these new viruses are on the rise because of that issue around zoonotic spillover. And we do need to have global organisations that collaborate around increased surveillance and detection. If you think back to Wuhan in December of 2019, if the Chinese had identified that virus within a week or 2 weeks of its emergence and shut it down immediately, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. So it's really important that we have heightened surveillance for other new pathogens that are likely to arise. And that also means New Zealand, because they're just as likely to arise from the South Pacific as they are to arise from China or Eastern Europe or anywhere else. Does anybody else want to comment before we finish?
Can I put in a plug for influenza?
Yeah.
So influenza A is a zoonosis, and it spread from animals to humans several times last century, so 1918, 1958, 1968, 2009. So yes, this is going to happen again in the future. My plug for influenza A is that New Zealand hasn't had an influenza epidemic last winter, nor the winter before, because we're in lockdown and our borders were closed. It's very likely we're going to have a lot of influenza A and B, for that matter, in winter this year, autumn through spring, actually. And so I think it's really important that another thing people can do, and university employees in particular, around students, etc., get our flu vaccines. And I think I'd love it if our flu vaccine rate would skyrocket, particularly this year. We're going to have it's going to be major impact on society and our healthcare sector this year.
And Nikki, do you want to have the last comment around flu, given your interest in flu?
Thanks. I think I've already made the statement that as we start learning to live with Omicron and we've got some degree of background immunity, we are talking about a respiratory strategy. And, you know, we've learned so much with COVID around how we could protect our communities broader than what we traditionally did. So I don't want to lose sight of our public health measures, protecting the whole community. Vaccination's part of a broader strategy. And when somebody uses the word freedom, I think this is about freedom for our community to protect all of our people, our vulnerable and everybody else. So it's a plea for us to try and walk a broader strategy in our heads about how that works for our schools, for our economy, for our social world, and for us in public health. So kia ora to all.
Kia ora, Nikki. Kia ora, Paparangi, Stephen and Helen. Thank you so much for coming online and giving us your insightful expertise and comments. And thank you everybody for coming online and asking some really tremendous questions. I do apologise. There are a lot of questions that you've asked we've had to skip through, but we're going to try and answer those offline after the webinar is finished. So I hope that's been useful, and I hope you've enjoyed eating your lunch while listening to COVID. Let's hope we're not going to have a part 3.